Hello, this is Jim Schaefer, executive producer and host of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. My guest today is Randall Baier.
It's interesting picking up on this post-hip-hop generation idea. M.K. Asante Jr., it's bigger than hip-hop. The rise of the post-hip-hop generation. This writer, M.K. Asante, is a well-known poet, filmmaker, and teaches at Morgan State University.
He's kind of immersed in the media stuff.
Right, media studies, the ground up, what they call the emic look from within, trying to get a feel for what the people who make the music are actually saying about what they're doing.
Well,
Which can be
and that's what I like.
mythologizing or
Yeah.
factual, I guess.
Well, and there's that kind of first line of response effect, where you're in it, and then you realize, oh, this is interesting, I want to study it. And it may not always work well, and since you're the first line, you're not going to have that luxury. I can remember taking a class on Chaucer, and there's all kinds of layers of criticism and scholarship on Chaucer because it's been decades and centuries since he existed. But I like it when the scholarship turns around and starts taking a look at things, and then that can be built on.
Well, it's certainly valuable to take the statements of the artists themselves and sort of parse through their own sort of sense of self, their sense of their place in culture, and how they spin their own identity, and then kind of try to take that apart and see, well, what are the ramifications for that on a broader cultural level.
Plus the idea that there's serious music going on besides Mozart, Bach.
Well, yes, yeah.
One of these.
I think we've crossed that Rubicon.
Yeah. One of the books I found that just a little quirky is this Violence by Slavoj Zizek, who's from, I believe, Slovenia, and he's a senior researcher in Slovenia, and he has this kind of quirky look. I mean, he's from the Eastern European things, but he's taken a look at violence, and there's that old debate about whether violence is bad per se or whether it has a justification.
Is this an analytical book? This is a book of
scholarship,
scholarship about violence?
Yeah.
It has the appearance of a novel, is what I was saying.
Yeah, no, it's a serious thing, and it's taking a look at history, philosophy, books, movies, Lacanian, psychiatry, and jokes. But he claims he's looking at the ways we perceive and misperceive violence. So he's probably got more of a Marxist, he's bringing new light to the Paris riots of 2005, questions the permissiveness of violence and philanthropy, and reflects on the powerful image and determination of contemporary terrorists. And then there's three forms, he says, of violence: subjective, which is crime and terror; objective, which is racism, hate speech, and discrimination; and systemic, which is the catastrophic effects of economic and political system. And I think this is where it gets into sort of a more Marxist approach. But it's a valuable discussion to have about what is violence. I mean, here we are talking about, at this point that in the United States, we're talking about terrorism. But one of the things, I mean, he is a bit quirky when he does it. Like he talks about fear thy neighbor as thyself. And he's taking that whole thing about love your neighbor
That sounds
and
like
kind of stands it on its head.
it sounds like the folkloric American axiom that good fences make good neighbors. I mean, I wouldn't call that necessarily violence, but it's a kind of paranoia, I guess. Is what,
Well, he stands things. He's very provocative. So he stands these things. So in this thing on fear thy neighbor as thyself, he's talking about as an enemy is someone whose story you've not heard.
Very interesting.
And that this proposed subject is not another human being with a rich inner life filled with personal stories which are self-narrated in order to acquire a meaningful experience of life, since such a person cannot ultimately be an enemy. But what he's turning around is, what if that person is not that? Is not about having a meaningful life. It means to do you harm. And so in that point, well then, what is a liberal attitude to freedom of speech? If you're dealing with a monster.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think, boy, you know, this,
Well, this sounds maybe that betrays or maybe that indicates his. I don't know if this is true, but his own particular personal background.
yeah.
I mean, in terms of European history or Western history, the last century of European history, I guess.
But
In some ways.
he raises.
I mean, this is a question.
I love stuff that's provocative,
Right.
raises like he talks about how David Remnick reported his attempt to visit in Moscow in 1988 Lazar Kagnovich, the last surviving member of Stalin's inner circle, who directed the collectivization program of 1929-1933, which was awful. And he said he wanted to see what he regarded as a truly evil person. Did Kagnovich still believe? I wanted to know. Did he feel any guilt, any shame? And what did he think of Gorbachev, the current general secretary at that time? But that wasn't it, really. Mostly I wanted to sit in the same room with Kagnovich to see what an evil man looked like, to know what he did, what books he kept around.
Did he have success in meeting him?
No.
It reminds me of a story by Ray Bradbury that's kind of telling. I mean, in terms of, this is an artistic interpretation of the same thing. It's about a man who, as a child, as a teenager, was tormented by a particular kid on his block. So he had carried this with him his whole life. And he finally decides that he has to purge himself of this feeling of evil and sadness and a hatred that he's built up. And he goes intending to do harm to this person out of the blue, to get him back, to revenge. So he gets to the house, and the person opens the door, and he's confronted by this sad-looking, middle-aged, overweight, balding figure of a human who's just gone downhill. You know, it's 40 years later after they were teenagers. And he recedes into the darkness, and the man is there. He sees the person, he sees the protagonist come to the door, kind of recognizes him, and then he says something like, Raymond, is that Raymond from junior high? Is that you, Raymond? And Raymond, the protagonist, recedes into the background, decides, my violence, my attitude is finished. I don't have to have revenge on this person because they've suffered they've gone through the change, they've met their own retribution. But in the case of, human history and monsters of violence, you can't exactly, this is a literary, kind of interpretation that Bradbury's trying to give us some kind of out, some kind of way of understanding. Maybe eventually you get your revenge, if you want to call it that, or maybe it's something as simple as eventually those who do evil will, suffer their own fate. I don't know the full meaning of that story, but it's always stuck with me about how eventually things turn around.
Well, in a chapter called Divine Violence, which I said this guy's really
okay, right, okay, sure.
But he brings in Alfred Hitchcock's film Psycho and the staircase murder of the detective Arbogast. And what's interesting, he uses this phrase, the Hitchcockian God's point of view shot. Now, Hitchcock does that a lot.
Definitely. Think of the birds. The whole opening scene of the birds.
And I was just
and when
struck
the fire
by that.
happens at the gas station.
Yeah. And so, that just struck me. There's this point of view from up above.
Right.
And that we can attribute everything that we think,
Oh.
And yet it's being deliberately manipulated by the director.
Exactly. You've got the Deus Ex, not machina, but not coming in after the fact, but controlling it from the beginning. The prime mover. Well, cinematically with Hitchcock, there's that awful scene. I don't think it's not. Is it Notorious or something? At any rate, the whole thing is a psychological. Based on the psychological trauma that the Gregory Peck character has of accidentally killing his brother, and his brother died by sliding down a the outside balustrade of a greenstone and impaled himself on a fence as a young boy. They were playing, and I think it's either Notorious or Suspicion or something, and that's exactly the kind of point of view of the camera. You're
from up above.
Up above as the boy slides down, you're seeing it from the point of view of the brother, who then suffers his whole life for the supposed, the death of his brother, which was not his fault. But that's exactly Hitchcockian.
But what he also does, now remember this,
It's
having read about this, Hitchcock always set up suspense by showing you the place where something was going to happen.
You're exactly right, because you
And
saw
so,
the
like
blade,
in the famous
shower
shower scene, he kept pointing to the shower, to the water pouring out of the faucet, and to this.
It's interesting because but thinking about this story, this book here, maybe that's what we're going. I mean, now with the effect of media and the way we think about something, I mean, just think about the buildup of the Iraq War, where we pointed by media every day to, this sort of destination, or, take
for
any
political
kind of,
purpose.
Exactly right. It was complete brainwashing on the point of view of our media, as well as the government in control at the time.
And he talks in here about the Hitchcockian resonance to the iconography of the 1911 catastrophe with the plane hitting the building.
The 9/11, right? The 9/11,
and it
right.
kept
The
seeing that shot.
replication of that.
But, I mean, I got sick and tired. I mean, it was a very short moment, but it was replicated
Right.
over and over and over again. And so it becomes something like The Birds. I mean, where you keep seeing this thing, where he says Melanie advances toward the Bodega Bay Pier in her small boat, waves to her future lover, and a single bird, first perceived as an undistinguishable dark blot, unexpectedly enters the frame from above right and hits her head. So I mean, there's this endless repetition that we attribute to being divine, but it just came from above, and so then you're getting this
Right.
catastrophic.
Well, it
element
sounds
to
like he's hinting that I don't know, this is interesting. Does art create life, or does life create art? Because we have gotten so media saturated now that I think sometimes we think actual events are almost like media created. And the scenarios that we imagine that an event will play out in is almost like a media-based reality in some ways.
But he's making a
don't
deeper
wanna take
point
too much of it,
about violence, that what he says is false anti-violence to the endorsement of emancipatory violence. But, we haven't sorted through all of this. We talk about terrorists, and there's that old thing. One person might be called a terrorist by one group, and they might be called a liberation fighter by another.
Right.
So I think what he's doing is challenging. There's another thing here that I find really fascinating. He says it's difficult to be really violent, to perform an act that violently disturbs the basic parameters of social life. When Bertolt Brecht saw a Japanese mask of an evil demon, he saw how its swollen veins and hideous grimaces all betake what an exhausting effort it takes to be evil. The same holds for violence which has any effect on a system. So he's challenging some of our thinking about, well, what is violence? How should we react to it? And the central question, like I said earlier, is, was there some kinds of violence that are acceptable and some that are not? If he says, if one means by violence a radical upheaval of the basic social relations, then, crazy and tasteless as it may sound, the problem of historical monsters who slaughtered millions was that they were not violent enough. Sometimes doing nothing is the most violent thing to do. So, I mean, he's really pushing the limits.
Sounds like he's been influenced a bit by surrealism as well.
Well, I
to
think
some
there's several
degree.
Marxist things.
Yeah, I think
because
I
there
think
are
maybe
some
so.
kinds
And
of
it
violence.
seems like
But
his
you
own
can see
particular
how deep the
upbringing.
discussion is, and how we do need to define our terms carefully,
Mhm.
because we can't paint with just a broad stereotypical
Yeah,
brush and
right.
say, well, everything's violent, and so therefore it's
Right.
bad.
And we have a different look at this from I think just across the pond, you know, a different. I think an American look is a very different. I mean, maybe not so much now because we've actually gone through some pretty serious, violent, events on our own land, in our own land.
See, I thought it was
But it's
fascinating that
not
people
like
were
what's-
so
what Europe has been
surprised
through.
that we had the September 11th thing happen.
Mhm.
We've
You mean
been
Americans were surprised?
Americans were so, oh, how could that
But that-
happen here? The only
But
reason,
it had been predisposed. I mean, it was.
well,
meant
and
to
the
happen.
only reason it hadn't happened before is because we're a large land-based nation that doesn't have a whole lot of bordering countries, you know, and there's big bodies of water,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
that protect us.
All right.
And so it's fairly logical to assume that there would be someone who would attack you if you're a world leader, superpower. And after 1989, we were it.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it'd be logical to be attacked.
Well, do we have time for more?
Yeah. One more here. Why don't we take a look at this one?
Yeah. Well, this one is something that's close to my interest. Fixing School Food in America. The title is Free for All. Subtitle: Fixing School Food in America by Janet Poppendieck, and it's produced by the University of California, Berkeley Press. You know, this is a very, very big issue. I mean, it gets into, it touches the distribution channels of food. It touches the core of American agriculture. It touches things like, I mean, government subsidies for schools and nutrition issues. I mean, I'm sort of rambling because, I mean.
Well, the person who endorsed the book, one of them is Marion Nestle, and she's the head of nutrition at New York University, and I've interviewed her on her book, Food Politics. And she and some of her students have really taken off against the food industry and the pet food industry even, because of this thing about the sugar. You know, that's what I call it, is the sugar.
The sugar, right.
And here, what's being served in schools is corporate decisions, deals made with school districts. Is that good for the kids? No. Also, what kids want to eat is influenced heavily by what they see in the commercials.
Well, I mean, completely. I mean, the offerings and I know there's been a major breakthrough in just getting water. Something as simple as water. I mean, you could argue that, okay, Nestle controls the water industry, but it's such a sea change to get water put in those vending machines instead of, you know, major soft drinks like Coke or Pepsi or the whole series of.
Well, there's a trend now to take all
and
the
even juices.
all the pop and take it off campus. In other words, get rid of it because they don't really need it. It winds them up and it gives them sugar, and then that's a bad deal.
But you're right, that's just one, the liquid intake is one aspect of it. The amount of corn syrup and whatever, the sugar as you call it, that's in food is completely, the food that's fed, apart from what vegetables are given out. I mean, you know, we have industry packaging fruit. Instead of it just an apple, you'll get a packaged, say, Del Monte fruits. So it's, you know, it's full of sugar syrup. But it goes beyond. It's a sense of nutrition. Maybe because I live in a town where you know, we have an enormous obesity problem in the States. It's being it's in the media now. The First Lady of the country is, you know, that's one of her causes, and it's become an epidemic. I mean, it's a serious health issue now, and it's from the bottom up. It starts at the bottom.
Well, when you have kids eating Pop-Tarts for breakfast,
Sure.
which is pure sugar,
Pop-Tarts,
and then they go to
cakes,
school
and they
and
go to
drink-
cakes, and they get pizza, and people say, "Oh, pizza's a balanced food because it's got, you know, it's got a carbohydrate, it's got a tomato sauce, it's got cheese, a milk product or whatever, and some kind of meat." I mean, this is just one could. I'm sure this is a much more intelligent, thoughtful than the level of interaction I'm giving it right now. I mean, I'm speaking more as a parent than a scholar on this topic.
But it's addressing a deep need, and it is a huge problem because you're not going to improve the obesity challenge that we face for kids unless we change the nutrition and we change the commercials about what's desirable to eat.
Going green. I love the cover here. The cover actually is a very clever cover because of the colors it's using. It's using colors that are almost traditionally used to attract kids to food, but it's opposing French fries with broccoli, and that it's, if you say, you know, going green, we have to kind of like say, all right, let's go green on our food as well as kind of our energy policies, because you know, she's opposed two foods that are they're diametric. If you ask any kid, what are they going to eat? They're going to go for the French fries.
One of my students is from India, and he doesn't like French fries. But he says he just can't eat them. You know, and a lot of people know. I think they even fry them in cottonseed oil or something. Because it's just has to be hot and liquid in order to do it.
It's one of those empty foods that will fill you up, but actually 10 minutes later, you're not energized in any.
And so I asked him, I said, well, what would you rather eat? Well, he said rice.
Rice, yeah,
You know,
okay.
That's more.
Two carbs, one's fried, the other. Yeah, well, you know, it's interesting. I think a lot of it might not just be nutrition itself, literal nutrition. Like, okay, you're getting this many calories of food, protein, whatever. I think some of it is just a psychological, cultural satisfaction. And unfortunately, what we perceive as, you know, being fed, being full, being satisfied, is oftentimes empty calories that don't give us the basic nutrition that, say, school kids need to have during the day. Or some families or some kids need that nutrition for their life because they're not getting it at home.
But what you're raising, why are the kids eating that? That's what this book deals with, is the deep politics of food provision from multiple perspectives: history, policy, nutrition, environmental sustainability, taste, and more. And she based on interviews with office officials, workers, students, and activists to evaluate the national school lunch and breakfast programs. Because the lunch programs, you know, are the ones that are particularly directed at people of low income. And, you know, how do we get into the absurd situation in which nutritionally regulated meals compete with fast food items and snack foods loaded with sugar, salt, and fat? From what I understand, McDonald's puts sugar on their French fries.
You know what it does? It makes a crisper French fry.
But it also
That's why you put sugar on it.
But it also is addictive, though. And
well,
so you gotta have it.
That's like, Jim, that's like saying that, you know, I mean, it's addictive for a number of reasons. It's not just because the sugar's in it. I know, it's addictive because it's a carb, it's a fried food.
But it's also something that, you know, if you sprinkle a little magic dust on it, people will come back for more because they just love that
stuff. In the case of French fries, I think it's addictive because it's culturally addictive. The French fry, if somebody actually tasted a French fry, they would determine that it was quite bitter about 2 minutes after they ate it, if you really taste it. And I apologize to the pomme frite lovers of the world and the highly aesthetic French fry that you'll get in a high quality restaurant, you know, cooked at the right temperature in a beautiful peanut oil. But I think most people could argue that that's not the common experience. You know.
Well, she talks too. You know, like some of the schools are using the a la carte system. And that doesn't always resolve the problem because of all the inculcation that people have received about what's desirable, and so then you still get the cookies, bagels, sodas, you know, and that kind of thing going on. And I've read about that even here locally, where they try to put in a la carte, and the kids will pass by the broccoli and everything else on the way to get the pizza.
I mean, you can't expect anything else. This is what's the problem is. The food debate is almost as frustrating as the healthcare debate. because
Well, it's all part of it.
exactly.
Yeah.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, but it's almost like you can't overcome the natural choices that children are going to make. Well, they're making those choices because it's a mediated event. It's almost like you're being programmed. But then on the other hand, there's a certain amount of agency that people have when they pick the food they want to eat, and a lot of that has to do with your family, your upbringing, the values you put around nutrition. We live in such a fast society that now it's so easy just to get a Pop-Tart and some quick juice product. You're just pumping yourself full of sugar.
Well, one point she makes is
Empty.
you pay now or you pay later.
Mm-hmm.
Either pay an extra 50 cents per lunch so that you can have better nutrition,
Mm-hmm.
or you're going to be paying in healthcare costs.
Healthcare down the line. That's the policy implications that many people. And pretty soon they're going to start charging you an extra add-on fee because of your weight. Because they're going to have you do tests with the doctors to find out that your hemoglobin is at a higher level than it should be. Your glycosylated hemoglobin.
My glycosylated people. Oh my gosh.
So
Well, it costs you more if you go to fly in an airplane and you're way too much.
Mm-hmm.
You have to pay for another seat.
This is where the policy implications.
One of the things she talks about too is maybe moving the foods program out of the Department of
Mm-hmm.
Agriculture into the Department of Education.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting. Yeah, that would be a sea change in appreciation. I'm cursed by my own opinions about the issue, having kids of my own in school and seeing what passes for nutrition in my own local school. When these things could be changed easily without. I live in a town of farmers. The farmers could supply the food, good food, to these kids. But we don't. We don't do that. We rely on, corporate influenced deals and stuff that comes from the Department of Agriculture food banks, or I call it a food bank. The warehousing process, and highly milled flours, and all kinds of just products that has to be passed through the market. Well, we've touched quite a lot of topics today and did some in-depth looks.
Well, I just want to cite in one more,
Okay.
which is Writing for Immortality, Women and the Emergence of High Literary Culture in America by Ann Boyd. And this is a fascinating book because it studies 4 prominent members of the first generation American women who strive for recognition as a serious literary artist.
Mm-hmm.
Louisa May Alcott,
Mm-hmm.
Elizabeth Stewart Phelps, Elizabeth Stoddard, and Constance Fenimore Wilson. So there's quite an interesting thing about the androcentric or male-dominated culture. And this is an example of, again, some work on bringing out this other side to it of, new ambition. So thanks for being on Rip Rap again.
It was great to be here.